Welcome back to another video. My name is Michael. I'm the founder of Buffalo Performance and Analysis, where we combine sports science, strength and conditioning, and sports performance to give coaches the tools necessary to build the next level of elite athletes. In this video, we're looking at how we can describe and summarize data utilizing R. Before we get started, we're going to be working with another package today. So we're going to install the package mass, and then we're going to call it into our library. Describing and summarizing data in R is important because it's going to provide us with additional information regarding our data set. So we can call on the IQR of our data set, and we're going to call on just the result column. So we can look at the interquartile range, we can look at the variance of that column, and we can actually even call on the summary function. And the summary function is going to provide the minimum, the first quartile, the median, and the mean, the third quartile, as well as the max. So that gives us a good breakdown of the data. We can also call on multiple columns. So here we see that we're utilizing the pipe function, and we're selecting the result and the rating, and then we're looking at the summary of those two columns. Now I use this dplyr at the beginning here because the mass package that we added also has a select function, so we need to distinguish which select function we're calling from which package. So when I run these lines of code, it's going to return the summary of both the result and the rating of the All Blacks. Next, we can actually utilize the summarize function to create a table that shows the lower, average, upper, and the spread of our data. So here we're going to call on our data frame. We're going to group by the opposition's name. Then we're going to summarize, where we're going to have a column called lower, and that's going to be the minimum of the opposition rating. We'll have one called average, which is the average or the mean of the opposition rating. We'll have the upper column, which is the max of the opposition rating, and then we'll have a spread column, and that's going to be the max minus the minimum. And then we're going to arrange it by the average, and then we're going to view it. So when I run these lines of code, it will return the columns. So we have the lower, average, upper, and the spread, and it's rating it, or arranging it rather, by the average. So we can. Another function we can utilize in R is the count function. The count function is going to show us how many times a certain factor occurs in the data frame. So for this one, we're going to be utilizing the count function to call on the opposition's name, and we're going to see how many times the opposition's name occurs within the data frame. So when I run these lines of code, it's going to pull up a little table here. We see that Argentina occurred 17 times, Australia 46, and we can even sort it in ascending order so we can see how many times each team was played. Additionally, we can run this for the location. So it's the same format, but now we're counting the location. So when we run this line of code, it's going to show us how many times each location was played. Moving past that, we can actually call on two column names within the same count function, and it's going to show us how many times each opposition played at each location. So when we run this line of code here, it's going to pull up a new data frame where we have the opposition column and the location and the number of times that game was played. So Argentina played in Auckland only one time, but Argentina played in Buenos Aires 4 times. Utilizing the table function, we can do a very similar thing, but it's not as neat. So I think it's better used when we have smaller data sets. It's going to return it in our console down below, and we're going to see how many times each team occurs inside the data frame. So again, it's not as nice and neat as when we use the count function, but we can still use that. If you want, you can use the add margins function before the table function, and that's going to provide each team at each location and how many times they were played, but it's also going to return the sum of how many times they were played. Now again, this is a larger data frame, so it's not as optimal, but this can be a useful tool. Moving forward, you can utilize the proportion.table function before the table function again, and that's going to return all our values as a proportion. Then you can actually multiply it by 100, and that's going to return it as a percentage instead of a proportion. We can also use the proportion.table function before our table function, and that's going to return all the results as a proportion. So at the end, we're going to multiply it by 100. That way, our results are as a percent. The last function that we're going to talk about for describing and summarizing data in R is the pivot wider function. The pivot wider function operates very much like a pivot table does in Excel. So we're going to create a new data frame and call it AB3. We're going to utilize the select filter from dplyr, and we're going to select only the location, result, and the opposition name. Then we're going to utilize the pivot wider function. We're going to call it on the data frame AB3. We want the names or the column names to be from the location, and we want the values to be from the result. So let me run these lines of code. So the table that it returns has the names from the location. It has the opposition names on the left side of the data frame, and the values that are inside each box are going to be the result of the game. So when Canada played in Melbourne, the result was 62. Brisbane in Australia, there's multiple games that were played there, so we have multiple results inside that box. While Pivot Wider is a useful tool, it's not always the best fit. It all depends on your data frame. When we look at when Australia played in Sydney, we see that there's so many results that they can't even fit them all inside the box. So it depends on the data frame, it depends on the data that you're working with and what you're trying to describe and summarize within it, but I wanted to give an example of how Pivot Wider works. This is the end of our describe and summarize video utilizing R. In our next video, we're going to look at how to visualize data utilizing R.